Prynhawn da I bawb, a croeso cynnes iawn i'r cyntaf o 3 cyfarfod sy'n mynd I fod yn trafod yr economi sylfaenol. A very warm welcome to everyone to the first of 3 events that we have organised this week addressing the foundational economy. My name is Ian Rhys-Jones and I'm Director of the ESRC Civil Society Centre and we've been awarded a 5-year centre grant to look at aspects of civic stratification and civil society, and part of that work involves a theme that specifically addresses the foundational economy, and I'm leading that theme with Professor Kevin Morgan from Cardiff University. We were hoping, as part of that theme, that we would have a face-to-face international conference in Cardiff at this time, but obviously events have overtaken it. Our intention was to have a meeting that brought together academics, practitioners, key policy actors together, and I hope that we've succeeded in doing that with these 3 events that we've arranged for the next 3 days. Before I hand over to Kevin, I should say we are recording the talks, and as members of the audience, you won't be recorded unless you ask a question. And we, in the spirit of having an open discussion, once we've had talks from our guest speakers, we have arranged a Q&A session, and it's possible for you to ask questions through the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. If you tick on that and put in your question, if you preface your question with the word talk, then we will endeavour to let you in so you can ask your question on a face-to-face basis. We will also have a short break before the discussion. The other thing I should warn you is that because of the way the system is set up, once we've finished the Q&A session, it will close down rather abruptly, so we won't have time to thank our speakers and you for attending. So I'd say some thanks to everyone before we begin, and also hope that you can all come back and attend the other 2 sessions that we've planned for the next 2 days. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Kevin Morgan, who's going to chair today's session.
Thank you, Ian. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have 3 excellent speakers this afternoon. Each one of them will speak for 20 minutes. Then we'll have a 5-minute break after the 3rd speaker, during which time participants will be invited to send in their questions, as Ian says, on Q&A, on the Q&A function. And then I'll read some questions out for those who want me to do so. For those who want to speak themselves, just preface it with talk. So as I say, each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a 5-minute break. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, who is Theis Hansen. Theis is a senior lecturer in economic geography at Lund University in Sweden. And without further ado, Theis, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. I'll just share my screen here so you can see my slides. All right. Okay, well, first of all, obviously, thanks a lot for the invitation to speak in this seminar. So I was asked to talk about foundational economy 2.0, and in particular sustainability in this. So the title of my talk is FE 2.0: Implications for Interregional Inequality and Environmental Sustainability. So I will start by admitting straight out that I'm very sympathetic to the central ideas in the FE approach. So this figure here is from my own master's thesis a long time ago, back in 2009, which shows the share of manufacturing employment in Denmark. And you will find figures of sort of very similar types in the 2018 Foundational Economy book. So back then I took this as a starting point for asking, what explains the persistent importance of low-tech and medium-low-tech manufacturing industries, even though policy continuously focuses on the 10% of the employed in manufacturing that are in high-tech industries. However, I think the foundationalists have gone much further than that, essentially developing a whole new model for economic development, which is focused on the parts of the economy which otherwise gets very little attention. And I would just start by saying that I very much applaud this focus. So being an economic geographer, a main interest of mine is to reflect upon whether FE is providing us with answers to some of the core challenges we face when it comes to regional development. So today I'll focus on two of these, which connect directly to questions around sustainability. So the first is interregional inequality, which is essentially about understanding the possibilities for living decent lives, irrespectively of where you live or where you're born. The second one is environmental sustainability and how regional development policy addresses this. So the main point here is that these are challenges that sort of the traditional mainstream approach to regional development hasn't solved yet. And when I talk about this mainstream approach, then I'm essentially thinking of one that's focused on improving the innovativeness of firms and systems with a specific focus on high-tech, R&D intensive and traded industries. So what I'll talk about here today is whether a FE approach to regional development can help us address these challenges. And I'll do that both in relation to the first FE approach, but also thinking about these questions in light of the series about Green Report, which Julie will talk about later in this session, and which is, I understand, the first sort of tangible output from the work on Foundational Economy 2.0. So assuming that most of you are familiar with FE 1.0, then I'll simply say that some of the main tenets are that these welfare critical goods and services should take center stage in economic development efforts. So that implies focusing on the mundane services that deliver water, food, and energy, but also health, education, and elderly care. And furthermore, so-called social licenses are argued to be central interventions. So they're essentially social obligations in return for the right to operate in markets that are partly sheltered from competition. So they are a way of securing social returns, such as minimum wages or and the use of local suppliers. So again, Julie will in a minute present the recent work on FE 2.0. So I'll simply say here that there's very clearly an ambition here of giving environmental sustainability a much more central position in the framework. And that also has implications for the types of economic activities that are considered foundational, but we'll get back to that in a bit. So the problem of interregional inequality is that certain European regions are characterized by persistent underdevelopment, which implies shorter and lower quality lives for their inhabitants. But this is not just a problem for these regions, as shown, for example, in the work of Andres Rodriguez Posse, you'll see in the middle here, on the revenge of places that don't matter. Because this leads to populism on both the left and the right wing of the political spectrum, and then includes also the well-known sequelae in the form of erosion of democratic institutions and disregard for international conventions. So consequently, there is a need for rethinking research and policy on the development of less developed regions, and increasingly so. So as illustrated by this figure here from The Economist, the rich are getting richer, and the level of regional inequality that we are now seeing in some European countries is just simply staggering. And even the IMF is now acknowledging in the 2019 World Economic Outlook that this is a serious issue, which also implies that populations in lagging regions are suffering from much poorer health conditions. So what is then the promise of the foundational economy when it comes to addressing this issue? Well, the FE approach argues convincingly that the regional scale is central to organizing the delivery of foundational services, which are tied to either physical infrastructures or the need for face-to-face interaction or human-to-human interaction. So because of that, foundational services are geographically distributed, and foundational employment is particularly important in less developed regions. So in that sense, foundational economy arguably provides an improved starting point for thinking about embedded regional development policies in less developed regions. Now I want to share with you some recent work we've been doing in Lund on priority setting on the level of municipalities in Denmark. So we've been analyzing strategic planning documents for all the 98 Danish municipalities to understand the extent to which they give attention to foundational sectors or rather export-oriented sectors. So Danish municipalities have formal responsibility for delivering many foundational services. So we expected that FE sectors would, sort of on average at least, be highly prioritized. And this is indeed also the case. So we find that in 78% of all the Danish municipalities, you find a main or exclusive attention to foundational sectors in their strategies. However, what we also find is that it's particularly municipalities in and around Copenhagen and the other large Danish cities that prioritize the foundational economy. So rural municipalities are less likely to give priority to FE sectors. Now, following this mapping of priorities, we've also made a qualitative comparative analysis of 2 rural municipalities, which basically suggests that foundational priorities are put central on the agenda in the absence of other options. And furthermore, this focus on foundational priorities is rolled back in times of crisis because it's considered that it would send the wrong signals, that municipalities cannot afford this in times of hardship. So the main conclusion here is that the FE sectors are generally high on the municipality's policy agenda, but at the same time, the foundational economy is unfortunately still not considered the basis for economic development, but rather something that municipalities can afford to prioritize when the economy is growing. Now, considering a bit more critically whether FE can constitute a future development model for lagging regions, I would first of all argue that there is a need for greater consideration for developments around digitization. So if you go to a high school in the north of Sweden today, there's a great chance that your classroom will look like this. So we are witnessing a speedy development towards distance provision of many providential services in many peripheral areas, at least when we talk about the Nordic countries. So on the positive side, this provides possibilities for providing a broader range of services to peripheries. However, there's also the risk of social exclusion. And most importantly, this naturally also leads to a spatial concentration of the production and employment of foundational services in urban centers. So in summary, I think there is still an important question on the implications of digitization for the ability of the FE approach to address interregional inequality. A second critical point is concerned with the ability to govern the foundational economy. So as noted by Bentham and colleagues in the Foundational Economy Manifesto back in 2013, this is indeed tricky stuff. And there's a need for empowering and upskilling regional governments. However, I'm somewhat skeptical to the suggestion that the answer to this challenge is necessarily decentralization. So first of all, we know that the quality of government is a central predictor for levels of development. And secondly, we also know that the effects of decentralization are significantly conditioned by government quality. So essentially, if we decentralized authority and resources to poorly functioning governments, well, this is going to bring negative impacts for these regions. So the conclusion here is that for FE to constitute a coherent approach to regional development in lagging regions, there's also a need for a greater consideration for developing the institutional capacity in these regions. So are these critical aspects then considered in this new FE 2.0 report? I'd say yes, that in some way they are, but that also raises new questions. So in my reading here, the conceptualization of the foundational economy is quite different. So in 1.0, we talk about welfare critical goods and services to get us through the day. While in 2.0, we also talk about activities that preserve nature and secure the well-being of future generations. So not just well-being today. So given this new conceptualization, for example, the forestry and wood industry in Wales, which is sort of the topic of this report, can be considered foundational activities. Now, on the one hand, I think this provides a part of the answer to the question regarding digitization of providential services, in the sense that forestry provides an alternative which is very immobile, at least in the early parts of the value chain. But it also comes at a cost of some clarity around what is actually considered foundational activities. I think there's a very clear demarcation of this in FE 1.0, but I wonder if this can be maintained when we talk about the new 2.0 version. So I'll move now on to the second central regional development challenge that I want to highlight, which is namely that of environmental sustainability. So if we go to the literature, we'll find some case studies of regions that have managed to combine this innovation-led development model with greening of the environment. However, I think it's fair to say that in general, we have no systematic evidence that suggests that innovative regions are also greener. And I guess I don't have to stress that this is quite problematic given the urgency of tackling in particular climate change. So the core question here is, can the foundational economy approach help us addressing this challenge? I think it's fair to say that environmental sustainability received quite marginal attention in FE 1.0. So Heslop and colleagues talk about the need for deeper thinking about this, while Andrew Sayer calls it the elephant in the room. However, I wonder if this lack of attention in FE 1.0 is also a result of sort of a missing recognition of possible trade-offs between social and environmental aspects. As illustrated by the writings on this French yellow vest here, which basically says less taxes, more purchasing power. We want to live, not survive. This point is closely connected to the question of how foundational priorities are established. So the suggestion in the 2018 book is that the blindingly obvious starting point is to ask citizens what they want. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that, for example, citizens are much more eager to own a car than to support subsidized public transport. And this is unfortunately not really surprising if we go to the literature on environmental psychology, which has provided us with quite detailed insights on the multiple barriers at the individual level that prevent environmental behavior, including factors such as a perceived distance to environmental problems in time and space, and personal preference against pro-environmental behavior. Now, in the new FE 2.0 report, there's a very clear ambition of placing the environment in a central position in the FE approach. So as I briefly mentioned, this report is focused on the wood-based economy in Wales. And among the important reasons for why this sector is considered foundational are various positive effects in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also providing positive impacts on, for example, biodiversity. So I very much applaud the environmental focus that is brought to the table in this report. But it also appears to me that sort of supporting the Wales forest economy is almost a self-evident way forward. So it's a bit like a Kinder egg where you can have it all. So not chocolate, gift and surprise, but improved environment, better opportunities for economic development and improved livelihoods. So the point here is that the choice of case does not really require addressing the question of priorities and trade-offs between different dimensions of sustainability. A second important aspect in relation to environmental sustainability is the question of how to achieve it. So given the lack of focus on environmental sustainability in FE 1.0, this is also not very clear, but it seems to me when I read the book that the suggestion is that we can sort of include environmental standards in social licenses. But it's not completely clear, also because it's not exactly explained how the content of social licenses will be established. However, we know from the literature on socio-technical transitions, which is explicitly concerned with understanding how we can transition towards greater sustainability in the socio-technical systems that deliver foundational services, that this requires sort of multidimensional changes, both on the supply side and on the demand side of services. So environmental requirements towards service providers are just one part of the puzzle. I mean, it might be a very important part, but for instance, modified consumption practices, which may result in additional efforts or costs for citizens, would be equally important here. So the literature also suggests that sustainability transitions are so complex that single policy instruments will not suffice. And consequently, there's a need for thinking about entire policy mixes and not just single instruments. Now, if we ask the same question to FE 2.0, how to actually promote environmental sustainability, then my reading of the recent report tells me that the answer is significantly more sophisticated than in FE 1.0. So actually social licenses are not at all mentioned in the report, but there are a number of other different policy instruments that are put on the table. So efforts to increase the legitimacy of the forestry industry, financial support programs that provide patient capital, competence development, market development policies, political guidance and direction setting, attention to coordination along supply chains, and support for product experimentation. So there's a much wider focus in terms of the types of interventions that need to be established in order to make a transition happen. And I'll just mention that sort of the various focus areas of these suggested interventions actually map very, very nicely on the different functions that are identified in the literature on technological innovation systems. So I think this highlights firstly that there are insights in this literature that could provide very useful for thinking about interventions in the foundational economy approach. But it also illustrates that the thinking around policies has developed considerably from FE 1.0 to 2.0. So final slide. So from my point of view, FE 2.0 clearly marks an important step forward. First of all, because of this explicit attention to environmental sustainability, but also because of a much broader conceptualization of the scope for policy action, you can say. But there are also some points that I think needs further attention. So first of all, a discussion around what is actually foundational and how do we establish this, in particular, given the added complexity of specific attention to environmental sustainability in the framework. And the second and related point is then thinking about processes of priority setting and questions around hierarchies of needs. So these are central topics in ecological economics, which has, for example, worked with establishing different decision support tools for situations where trade-offs between sustainability dimensions are very evident, and also worked on principles for evaluations and assessments of policy. And perhaps this type of work would also offer some insights that can sort of help the further development of of this very promising way forward with Foundational Economy 2.0. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you very much for the attention. Thanks to Madeleine and Birgitte, two colleagues in Lund who work with me on this topic. And of course also to the funders who provide time to think about these types of issues. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Stop
Cees.
sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. You have to imagine ecstatic applause at this point, Cees, for an excellent presentation. Many
Thanks
thanks.
a lot, Kevin.
We now move on to our second speaker, Lars Koenen. Lars is Professor of Innovation and Sustainability Transitions at the Moen Center for Innovation and Regional Development at HVL in Bergen in Norway, where he runs the PhD program on responsible innovation and regional development. Welcome, Lars, and over to you.
Right, thanks a lot, Kevin. And thanks to the Wales Institute for Social and Economic Research for organizing the seminar series. I was really looking forward to come and visit Cardiff. I've never been to Wales before, and I was also really keen to get to know this community a little bit better. So it's unfortunate that we couldn't do it with a physical conference, but at least we've got this seminar series as a next best alternative. So the title of my talk is going to pick up a bit on some of the themes that Cees already addressed. I'm asking myself, what kind of innovation for a foundational economy in sustainability transitions? And thanks a lot to Cees also for sort of outlining some of the basic ideas behind the foundational economy, both 1.0 and 2.0, and I'll gratefully sort of depart from that. So I should also confess that I'm normatively and politically very sympathetic to a lot of the ideas of the foundational economy, and very much recognize and sympathize with its potential to transform regional development thinking and practice. But let me just maybe make more explicit sort of what the allure of the foundational economy 2.0 really is. To me, it's very much that it puts the purpose of the economy really sort of in a societal context, and not the other way around, as often has happened and is happening in economic thinking. So it's citizen-centric. It really sort of forefronts the well-being of citizens and not just abstract growth rates. It's socially responsible. It questions moral and ethical issues. These are not just ignored or siloed, but really integrated in economic analysis. And as a result, policy and politics are not just an afterthought, sort of a policy implication, but really at the sort of the core of thinking and of research. And I think it's very nicely sort of framed with the metaphor of careful policy and politics. And finally, counter to many debates and literatures around alternative economies, such as the degrowth model, foundational economic thinking is really also informed by solid empirical research. Now, in my talk, I'd like to sort of make some reflections on the foundational economy when faced with the sort of environmental sustainability challenges. And in doing so, I'll try to also sort of provoke some questions. In my own sort of journey, I am, as an academic, starting to think more and more about innovation in the context of sustainability transitions has also sort of brought much more a sort of normative political dimension to innovation. Whereas early work of myself as well on innovation was very much sort of assuming that all innovation is good and well. I've become increasingly reflexive about the pros and cons of innovation, and I think that hopefully signifies also sort of a process of sort of maturing thought. And similarly, I think that reflexivity is also beneficial when thinking about foundational economy. And I think the prospects look very good. The shift from foundational economy 1.0 to 2.0 sort of already alludes to that increased reflexivity by bringing in sort of the well-being not just of this generation of citizens, but also future generation of citizens, and increasingly acknowledging environmental sustainability as the elephant in the room of FE 1.0. And at the same time, I think there are some really interesting similarities between sort of sustainable development and foundational economy as big ideas. I think that is really a common praise to foundational economy readings. They really offer big and expansive ideas, and they provide economies of hope. Now, again, I very much sympathize normatively with the foundational economy, but I think a question that is still sort of begs some answers is, how do we realize the big ideas of the foundational economy? How do we mainstream foundational activities and foundational thinking in regional development theory and, of course, policy and practice? And in that sense, of course, the challenge is quite daunting, because I think what is clear is that the foundational economy indeed sort of implicates a paradigmatic shift in terms of thinking about regional and local economies and regional economic development. And it's a more capacious understanding of development, which is not just about the economy, it's about or technology, but it's also about culture, behavior, institutions, ethics, moral, etc. And in that sense, it ticks all the boxes of being a systemic paradigmatic shift. But one wonders then where to start. What's sort of the theory of change that would sort of materialize foundational economies? How do we kind of create greater attention for the foundational economy in mainstream policy thinking and economic thinking? And in that sense, I think there's a lot to learn, perhaps, from research on sustainability transitions, which really has looked at how a lot of innovations that provide opportunity for system innovation around renewable energy systems or around sustainable urban transportation, how they've really started very small in the so-called niches, but over time started to really sort of challenge the mainstream, the orthodox regime, and created transformative change. So that's I think one of the challenges, the sort of the pragmatic question how to realize the foundational economy. A third challenge would be how, in view of sustainability transitions, is how to go beyond localism. Essentially, sustainable development is a global project. Climate change is a global problem. And I think foundational thinking still sort of, there's still a lot of questions about how a sometimes sort of exclusive focus on the local can contribute to these global challenges. So what I'm sort of really trying to advocate here is, what also foundational economic thinking offers in terms of a research agenda. Where are sort of really the research gaps for FE? In this talk, I'd like to sort of zoom in on the question of what kind of innovation is required for foundational economy and sustainability transitions. And I'm sort of focusing on innovation, partly also to address the how-to question. And I'll do that in sort of two parts. I'll first sort of focus on some of the critiques on mainstream conventional innovation theory and policy, and particularly in the context of regional development, and then try to outline some contours of innovation in a foundational economy along sort of dimensions of form, process, and policy. So first of all, with regard to the limitations of mainstream innovation theory and policy. And here I'd like to sort of position the mainstream in sort of the literature on knowledge economy, more specifically theories of innovation systems, clusters that Thijs has already been alluding to, but also policy concepts such as smart specialization and innovation districts. And I'm a very sympathetic critic of this literature because I think it has contributed greatly to foreground knowledge and learning as key assets and processes in economic development, which have been largely neglected by mainstream economic thinking. And they've also really contributed to showcasing the progressive, emancipatory potential of human creativity, the importance of collaboration, networks, and the social dimensions and cultural dimensions of innovation, and not the least, how incredibly place-based innovation is due to local capabilities, local networks, local institutions. Nonetheless, despite sort of the richness of this work and literature, what strikes me is that still, as a rationale for innovation and as a rationale for innovation policy, there's still very much a predominance of productivity and competitiveness. So the firm is still very much the principal agent for innovation, and entrepreneurs and innovators are seen to sort of need to be sort of incentivized to take risks, to develop new products and processes and services, as they then get rewarded by competitive advantage in terms of productivity gains or temporary market monopolies. And in that sense, sort of a lot of the work on innovation and regional development sort of situates innovation in the tradable economy. And this is very much sort of also evident in smart specialization, which is very much about identifying those sectors and industries in the region that can provide global competitive advantage for export. This sort of discourse has been somewhat sort of unsettled recently by an increased sort of focus on global challenges and missions for innovation. And even though I very much sort of welcome this normative turn, at the same time it can again be criticized for being perhaps somewhat heroic or naive about how it seeks to sort of fix some of the wicked problems of contemporary capitalism in terms of territorial inequality or climate change. And in that sense, I'm a bit sort of sometimes pessimistic when people start to basically bring back the metaphor about taking man to the moon as sort of a similar mission as climate change, and sort of acknowledging that climate change as a mission is much more a political mission rather than just a sort of a straightforward technical mission. But there are also really challenges in the way that innovation is organized both in organizations and in policy, where we see that increasingly innovation is sort of becoming projectified. It has to, and that sort of, the innovation system as a result become increasingly fragmented, but also taking away the element of serendipity, surprise, and really the act of creativity in the innovation process. Because when you apply for funding for innovation, you need to already outline upfront what the expected results are. And this is obviously a lot sort of due to the rise of new public management and its focus on output efficiency. Another sort of challenge or limitation of innovation policy is that it's very much reliant on output legitimacy for its political and policy support. Basically, the line of argument is we need innovation because of economic growth, and we kind of distribute that through a trickle-down mechanism. But politically, innovation is mainly a non-issue for ordinary citizens. So there's very little sort of input legitimacy where people feel like they are really involved in innovation policies or innovation strategies. And even though, again, we see that sort of there's some development there with, you know, notions like quadruple helix and increased focus on sort of citizen involvement in smart specialization strategies, still, I think we very much sort of rely on that sort of output legitimacy for innovation support. And finally, a lot of the innovation literature has been very modernist, in the sense that it had been sort of primarily focusing on sort of the good of innovation and perhaps turn a blind eye to the dark side of innovation. And Thijs already referred to the work of Andres Rodriguez Pose about the revenge of the places that don't matter, that feel left out in this sort of innovation-fueled knowledge economy. But similarly, we see that concepts like smart cities are increasingly witnessing a sort of a backlash in terms of innovation, in terms of support from citizens. Now, I think what a focus on the foundational economy, when sort of acknowledging sustainability transitions, has to offer is partly a rethink in terms of what innovations are important and essential. And I'm not saying that the focus on technological innovation and Schumpeterian entrepreneurship is necessarily wrong. I just want to make the point that it is a partial understanding, perhaps, of what kind of innovation happens in foundational economies. And if we just sort of focus on sort of two main sort of understandings of, you know, what constitutes the foundational economy, foundational material services and providential services, it is clear that sort of we need to really take a more capacious understanding of the kinds of innovations we consider. For example, when considering foundational material services, this is really about the pipes, the cables, the networks, the branches that distribute water, electricity, gas, telecommunication. In short, we're talking about infrastructure. And I think there's some really interesting work coming out of the literature around foundational economy from people like De Broek et al. And Schaffer et al. That start to talk about sort of the urbanization sectors, industries that fix or move material to form human settlements of any size or scale. But I think sort of focusing on those sectors and how innovation figures in those sectors really also requires different understandings of innovation models beyond sort of the ordinary innovation system. And work on infrastructure innovation in the context of sustainability transitions by people like Frank Geel, Rob Rave, Bernard Ruffer has emphasized the extreme path dependence of old infrastructural systems, not just sort of in material terms, but also in institutional terms or in terms of vested interests. And the inertia that comes with transforming such infrastructures. It also sort of emphasizes the co-evolution of technological change with institutional change and with industrial dynamics. And this was sort of became very clear in some of the work that I've done in the past 3 years in Melbourne around urban forest infrastructures, where also sort of the co-benefits of such innovations become clear. This is not just about solving a sort of a market failure, but this is about innovations that provide contributions in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of increased livability of the city. So those sort of co-benefits are an important aspect also of innovation in the foundational economy. Another example that came to mind is really sort of an emphasis on social and grassroots innovation. And there's a lot of work happening in that space by people like Flora Avellino, Adrian Smith, Jill Safen. And an example that I've known from Melbourne was around sort of, initiatives around affordable housing that try to sort of combine affordable housing for young people that are at risk of becoming homeless, together with providing them bespoke educational support. But a challenge or an open question there is still sort of how those sort of social innovation or grassroots initiatives sort of stack up. There's a lot of discussion in that literature about scaling and how those social innovations scale, but also even more reflexively whether such local social innovations should actually scale, whether actually the sort of the value proposition is necessarily local. And this brings me to the aspect of sort of what constitutes the sort of the processes of innovation in a foundational economy context. And here the foundational economy literature makes some sort of slight reference to the work or the philosophical work of Roberto Ullnach, emphasizing the importance of disruptive, politically mobilizing experiments. Kevin and I have collaborated very much on this topic as well, and we see a sort of an increased emphasis also on understanding innovation processes as experimentation. But still the question can be asked, what kind of experimentation? What do we really mean with experimentation? And there's a varieties of ways we can understand experimentation here. There's work that focuses on entrepreneurial experimentation, emphasizing how different knowledge bases are being recombined and how
we seem to have frozen screens, and I wonder, Chloe, Lars was 1 minute from his close. Shall we move straight away to Julie?
Yeah, I think we should do that.
Okay, I'm very sorry about Lars freezing like that, but we'll move on right away to Julie Froud, who is based at University of Manchester Business School. And Julie has been one of the original architects of the foundational economy, and she's one of the authors of a recent report on reforestation. So Julie, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much also to Tyson and Lars for their presentations. There were lots of really interesting ideas, and lots more for us to think about. As is evident, we've come to the idea of sustainability relatively late in the development of the foundational economy, and there's a lot of work to do here. And so it's really great that lots of people are now kind of thinking about this and pushing us all to kind of develop our ideas further. So in that spirit, what I want to do is talk about the notion of foundational renewal. So what's this idea of moving towards foundational economy 2.0? And it's very much about a process. And I'm going to talk about this idea of the wood economy. Thijs mentioned it in his presentation. So the first part of the presentation is going to focus on the concept of foundational renewal, the attempt that we want to move towards this thing, foundational economy 2.0. So in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the what and the how. What is it we're trying to do? And more importantly, in some ways, how do we get there? I think where we're up to very much at the moment is struggling with the kind of the how aspect. And again, this came up in both of the earlier presentations. So how do we think about the process that's needed to shift us further in the direction we want to go to? And partly ways illustrating that, I'm going to talk about the idea of a transition towards a wood economy in Wales. Now, this may seem a little bit random, a little bit peripheral, and it's partly the kind of opportunism of research. This was a bit of research that came along, but it's been very interesting in terms of trying to think in particular about this how aspect of how do we shift towards a more sustainable economy. And what I'm going to argue is that a bit like Theis's the Kinder Egg idea, it sounds obvious, you know, multiple benefits, but huge coordination challenges. And in that sense, I think our arguments about the woodland policy echo lots of other areas of policy, particularly in the Welsh and UK context, where we see all kinds of coordination challenges standing between where we are and where we want to get to. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of foundational renewal. So if we go back a step to this thing that we're now calling the foundational economy 1.0, well, that was very much focused on citizen well-being. So trying to focus on meeting the needs, the current needs of citizens, particular focus on urban economies, though not exclusively. And a lot of the drive of this from the 1880s onwards was, you know, and very interesting in the current context, led by public health concerns. And maybe we forgot a little bit about public health along the way. But public health led development of these reliance systems, water and sanitation, housing, energy, mass transportation, telephony, which later becomes communications. And at the, you know, following on a little bit later, the development of universal health and education and the income maintenance schemes, pensions, social security, etc. So it's really focusing on meeting the essential needs as we were, you know, as they were evolving of citizens. And in all of this, we can, if we again think about the how did all of this happen? Of course, it's complicated and it depends upon the particular system, but the central state had a key role. So the state has had roles of coordinating provisions, sponsoring technologies, regulation, financing, in some cases direct provision, in other cases providing with a range of partners, whether it's private companies, not-for-profits, the local state, all kinds of organizations have been part of this process. So the complex process happening in different ways, in different times and different places. In terms of the benefits, then if we look back, we can see that in terms of citizen well-being, what this collection of infrastructure reliance systems delivered was significant increase in life expectancy and opportunity for enhanced well-being. So we should, whilst in many ways always attractive to focus on the imperfections, the lack of access, the fact that we haven't maintained and sustained these systems, that some of them are not fit for purpose. Nonetheless, I think we need to also sort of hold in our minds the fact that this original infrastructure did deliver huge improvements in life expectancy and well-being. So then we then think about, well, a lot of our basic infrastructure systems, whether it's healthcare, transportation, housing, these things have suffered from a range of problems. It could be underinvestment, it could be lack of access, it could be privatization, financialization. You know, lots of people have sort of spent a lot of time looking at the problems of this. And I think that the challenge of Foundation Economy 2.0 is to go beyond, well, we need to bring it back. We need to, you know, reinstate those infrastructure systems. Whereas what we need to do is, of course, we need to improve access to those basic essentials, which are still important, but we need to do that in a way that considers the well-being of future as well as current generations. So, of course, these material providential infrastructures remain very important, but we need to think about how those are renewed. And that requires thinking about, if we want to address nature and climate emergencies, we've got to think about how do we decarbonize some activities, how do we rebalance between activities. And again, if we think about the foundational economy systems, we see that these are not homogeneous. So the material systems, energy, housing, transport, food, these are generally high carbon producing systems. They're often land intensive systems. These are the systems that have contributed massively to the climate emergency. So on the one hand, they've delivered citizen well-being. On the other hand, they've left us with, with a big policy challenge. On the other hand, we have the providential systems, education, health, care. These, of course, remain important, but they don't place the same challenges on sustainability. These are often seen as being fiscally problematic in terms of sustainability, less so in terms of our carbon contribution. So there are some things we might do to expand some foundational services which don't raise climate emergency and nature challenges in the same way as the foundational ones. So this kind of brings us to the kind of key issue, which is about how do we think about the renewal process. And the two previous presentations were very helpful in this sense, because they were kind of getting at some of this dynamic sense of how do we kind of move from where we are to where we want to get to. And thinking about the wood illustration I'm going to talk about in a minute, two things to focus on in relation to the renewal process. The first is understanding the nature of the problem that we have. And many of the problems in the foundational economy are complex problems because they often have very long-term return profiles, by which I mean, if we think about the benefits that we get from the foundational economy, some of these benefits are very long-term. We invest now and we see benefits of public health or clean air or more forestry. These are benefits which are going to accrue over quite a long time period. And this is, is not, a puzzle in itself, but it can be an obstacle in terms of thinking about the investments that are required, because much conventional investment is based upon relatively short-term profiles. And the second problem we have are these asymmetries in the distribution of costs and benefits. So the beneficiaries of these infrastructures can be very widespread, can be very dispersed over time and space. The costs can be borne by other groups of people. And this is, again, it comes back to lots of the standard discussions that we've had already. So, but these are worth acknowledging because these problems are going to recur in relation to the forestry example. So when we think about the renewal process, the key issue is acknowledging three dimensions here, which are important to cracking the problem of how do we do it. The first one we identified is the issue about stakeholder alliances. Most problems associated with the foundational economy are complex problems with multiple stakeholders. And so the question is, how do we kind of acknowledge and respond to the issues raised by different groups of stakeholders? And how, as part of that, do we think about the involvement of citizens, when of course citizens are complex and don't necessarily, want the same things even within the group of citizens. Secondly, how do we think about financial models, financial governance, because most of these infrastructures require investment. So how do we deal with the limited set of policy tools and financial tools that we have? How do we think more imaginatively about how are things paid for and how are things governed? And third, not least of all, we have the problem about the politics of the whole thing. So how do we think about creating political space? How do we think about the coordination that's required? How do we think about overcoming resistances? And neither of these three things are trivial. So I think that it's important to acknowledge these are significant complexities. Okay, so what I'm now going to do for the rest of the presentation is sort of try and illustrate some of this by taking this example of a piece of research that a group of us have prepared in the last couple of months, which is about the idea of transitioning to a wood economy in Wales. And we have a draft report which we can send to people if they're interested. So the idea of the Welsh wood economy was a way of trying to kind of capture the benefits that we might get if we have, increased the area of woodland in Wales. So it's a sort of simple proposition is Wales is an economy, as we'll see in a minute, which has a relatively low land coverage with woodland. What benefits could we get if we had more woodland, including commercial woodland, so not just recreational and ecosystem woodland, but commercial woodland, and how would we get there? Okay, so the question, clearly there are issues about which trees to plant in which places. So this is a complex problem. You can't simply put any tree in any place. But how do we, if we assume that there's a way of deciding which trees go in which places, how do we then imagine and manage a transition? Okay, and the key word I think that came out of our research is this need for coordination. Okay, so on the right hand side of the screen you can see here's Tice's Kinder Egg. These are all the wonderful benefits that we would get from a Welsh wood economy. They're social, they're economic, they're ecological, they're local, they're global. It's tick, tick, tick. There's all kinds of things that the Welsh wood economy could deliver. So it's an interesting problem for us to look at, because at one level it seemed such a no-brainer. But when we looked at the detail, we were struck by the difficulties in actually moving through this transition process. So if we think about the starting point, where if we're starting from here and we want to get to a wood economy, well, you can see that woodland in Wales accounts for only 15% of the land area, significantly less than most other large European economies, and much less than in Scandinavia. Wales, for those who don't know it, is a mainly upland area, mostly livestock-based farming, sheep. Most important livestock, 40% of the sheep meat is exported almost entirely to the EU. So that's not going to be straightforward. And even before Brexit, multiple problems in the economics and sustainability of farming. But despite the attractions of woodland, there's been very little conversion of grazing land to woodland. So we have a kind of a situation where theoretically conversion to wood looks attractive, but practically it hasn't been happening. As a consequence, like the rest of the UK, Wales has been a net importer of wood. There's a kind of timberland deficit of a significant kind, and of course very high carbon costs associated with transporting a very heavy product long distances. And interestingly, again, in terms of the kind of environmental sustainability, if we think about wood and woodland as a resource, there's been a huge undervaluing of this resource. Most of the timber produced in Wales has gone into very low value products. Mostly about 60% has gone into fences, packaging and pallets, and about 20% into construction, which is about half the level that you see in places like Scotland. So Scotland has been successful at developing higher value uses of timber. So in all kinds of ways, even the limited amount of woodland for commercial purposes that does exist has not been used in ways that kind of have valued the resource as much as it could have done. Now, to come back to the question about how does timber fit into the foundational economy, well, one of the things we need to do is to upgrade housing, and timber-based construction is obviously going to be quite important in terms of the renewal of the construction sector. So it's a kind of input into a major foundational economy sector. So making residential housing and other buildings more fuel efficient, less carbon producing, is likely to require a greater value of timber production. So we have a kind of puzzle, and what you might be thinking is, well, surely Wales just needs a strategy on forestry. So if Wales decided that it wanted a forestry strategy, then it could deliver many of these benefits. But what you see, of course, is that Wales has a forestry strategy. It has a very good forestry strategy. There's an extract on the screen here from the forestry strategy of 2001. So in a sense, on paper, in theory, we have here a strategy for delivering a wood economy. Here's an extract from it. Wales will become known for high quality woodland, and these can deliver social community benefits, support thriving woodland based industries, and contribute to better environmental quality. So we have on the one hand the theory, we have the strategy that opens up the way to achieving the wood economy. And on the other side, we have the disappointing outcomes, very little increase in woodland in the last few years. Wales is also, as well as having a forest strategy, has a climate strategy. and this requires 100,000 hectares of woodland to be planted, about 10,000 hectares per year. Very quickly, it was evident that this had not been met, so the targets were scaled down to 2,000 hectares per year, and even that hasn't been met. In 2019-20, there were less than 50 hectares planted. So the scenario we have is that there's limited amounts of new planting, and it's been a challenge in the last few years even to replace the trees that have been cut down. So Wales is in a position where it's not expanding its forest area, it's having trouble even sustaining the planted area. Part of the problem is limited financial resources, £35 million of grants in Wales over a 10-year period. In comparison, in Scotland, 252 million. So, you know, Wales has put a very limited amount of financial resources into achieving this strategy. So we come back to this kind of renewal process and the three elements. We can see all of these elements being apparent in the kind of problem that we've identified, you know, the problem that stands between the strategy to have a wood economy and the reality that we don't yet have it. One of the first challenge is around stakeholders. There are numerous stakeholders here. We have farmers and landowners, we have rural communities, we've got the sawmills, the processors, the construction companies, the private house builders, the housing associations. So we've got stakeholders that represent both the demand side and the supply side, and we have an absence of a lead actor. One of the interesting things, if you look at Ireland, in ERA, ERA had even lower percentage of woodland 20 years back. They're 2% woodland, and they've got up to about 11% now, and with aspirations to get closer to 20% in the next phase. And one of the reasons why ERA has been more successful in this regard is it has a kind of an actor, an agency called Colta. It's an arm's length agency that's been able to manage some of these, not perfectly, but it's been able to manage some of these stakeholder alliance issues. And one of the things we see is the absence of this key actor in Wales. Secondly, second point was about financial governance. This is not simply about the inadequate grants to support new planting and the management of forestry, but it's about the ownership and management models around forestry. It's a long-term investment. You invest now, you're going to get returns in 30 or 40 years. This is a difficult process for people to manage, so we need creative ways of thinking about getting access to managing the forest that exists, thinking about a succession of new planting. We have to think about the supply chain around the processing of timber, think about the technologies and the investments that are required so that we not only have more trees grown, we have better management and harvesting of that timber, and we have it being used in higher value purposes rather than a lot of it being, you know, used for low value purposes. So there's a lot of elements here at different points in the supply chain, reflecting again demand and supply side that have to be aligned. And then finally, coming back to the political commitment, here are questions about how do we join things up and how do we make space. So, you know, if we think about the government machine, there's a lot of different departments of government represented in this problem. We've got uplands land use, we've got sustaining rural communities, we've got technology, development of new timber using technologies, new products. We've got aligning carbon reduction promises with the specifics of how do we get to a wood economy. So this is beyond any one small part of central or regional government. This is something that requires a lot of joining up that is obviously challenging. And from this point of view, the example of the wood economy is very interesting for us because I think it highlights broader problems in foundational economy renewal. So here's our attempt at a kind of transition diagram. Trying to think about how do we, you know, the supply chain is from the land use all the way through to the output. How do we think about moving, not switching completely out of all low value output, but how do we transition more towards a higher value output, which requires the alignment of the politics, the resources, the finance, and the technical aspects. So I guess, again, reflecting some of the earlier presentations, we kind of, you know, although we're not innovation academics, we've kind of, you know, I think we are thinking along the lines of sort of socio-technical kinds of transitions here. Okay, so to finish then, the wood economy we see as, you know, it's an exciting prospect. It's probably a little puzzling to our friends from Scandinavia that you know that we don't already have this, but it's a kind of it's an interesting problem because it kind of maybe gives us insights into other problems. So the wood economy is an important and exciting prospect. We think it can contribute to the foundational renewal. It's relevant to the renewal of key foundational sectors like housing. It's key to reducing things like transportation costs overall, because, you know, more local product can be used, less transportation costs. It also offers multiple benefits for a widely distributed group. And if we think creatively about all kinds of, not only the timber product, but the use value, the social infrastructure of woodland, again, thinking about citizenship, well-being, all of these things, then woodland is potentially a very key aspect. It's not simply productive, it's about social infrastructure. However, you know, we could get carried away thinking about all the theoretical benefits, but what it also does is highlight these coordination challenges. So if we want the transition, we've got to confront the coordination challenges around who are the lead actors, how do we align the different areas of policy, how do we think about financial models, how do we incorporate citizens, communities into what are long run projects. And if we do it well, there's a lot of community and citizen benefit. If we do it badly, it's something that people have to live with for a very long time. So I'll stop there, Kevin. Don't know what's happening now.
Kevin, are you there? I'm not sure if we've lost Kevin.
Okay, you could hear me, Chloe, I hope.
Yes, yeah, that was fine.
Good, that's fine. I don't know whether I'd be talking to myself for 20 minutes or not.
No, it's
Hi,
all good.
Chloe. Sorry, I'm back.
Oh, there we
now.
go.
I just wanted to announce a 5-minute break now, during which time people can submit their questions on the Q&A function, and we'll return for a collective Q&A discussion in 5 minutes. During which time, it's also worth remembering that Chloe will put up a slide, and here it is.
There we go.
Just to advertise the fact that there's a 30% discount on the new Foundational Economy book if people use the code, which is shown here. So see you all in 5 minutes when we return for a discussion, but please remember to submit some questions on the Q&A function. Many thanks. Okay, everybody, welcome back. We can now begin our Q&A session. And before we address the questions that have come in, can I first of all turn to Lars Kernan, who was sadly cut off rather abruptly because his screen froze. Sorry about that, Lars. And ask him, would you like to begin this session by just addressing his final conclusions that he would have addressed had he not been cut short? Over to you, Lars.
All right, and thanks, Kevin. And the apologies should be all from my side. We apparently had a very short sort of glitch of the Wi-Fi here at the university, and that's why I froze. So ironically, I came into university to have a better Wi-Fi, so I should have probably stayed home. Anyway, so apologies for that, but let me just sort of wrap up quickly. So, and hopefully this will sort of lead us also into a sort of a wider discussion. One point that I couldn't really make was also sort of to try and identify some of the, say, policy linkages between foundational economy and some of the sort of key concepts in sort of mainstream innovation policy around, say, missions, responsible innovation, which I think could be excellent levers to, again, sort of grow the appeal of foundational thinking in policy and practice. But by way of conclusion, the points I wanted to make was the following. When foundational economy really starts to engage with the sort of vexing challenge of sustainability transitions, I think what really immediately comes to mind is that sustainability transitions are unfolding across all spheres of the economy. And that then sort of puts immediately on the agenda an issue which I think has been a bit sort of underrepresented so far in the discussions, and that is the interconnections between foundational economy and other zonal economies, notably the sort of competitive tradable economy. Another important point, I think, is the foundational economy sort of very much puts emphasis on the lived experience, if you like, of communities, of citizens, of sustainability transitions. It brings sort of that abstract notion to the ground. And in doing so, it also kind of really sort of puts growing resistance and contestation of sustainability transitions or the green course on the agenda. And this is increasingly sort of also being looked at through the lens of so-called just transitions. So again, that sort of speaks to the sort of the grounded, the embedded sort of nature of foundational economic thinking. But when we again start to sort of address the question of how do we mainstream foundational activities in, say, regular regional development policies and strategies, we get into difficult relationships and tensions between evidence-based policy, active citizenship, and what you could call a crisis of expertise. So I very much sort of like the emphasis that foundational thinking puts on active citizenship and sort of, you know, having citizens as co-creators in innovation processes. But at the same time, I think an elephant in the room, if you like, is still, so how do we deal with active citizenship in an age of growing populism? And what if your citizens tell you that they don't want any immigrants? That's sort of, those are, I think, very difficult questions related to sustainability in a foundational economy. Then specifically about sort of innovation in the foundational economy, what sort of still sort of puzzles me is how to think about the incentive structures for innovation in the foundational economy. I think we've thought it pretty well through in a market sort of tradable economy, you know, how innovators are being incentivized. But sort of if we think beyond sort of that competitiveness rationale, what makes innovators sort of innovate? That's, I think, still an open question. Then in relation to the first point about the interconnections also, I think we can start looking at innovations and see how they travel between tradable competitive economies and the foundational economy. And in that sense, sort of also puts more emphasis on a neglected sort of aspect, and that is sort of the diffusion of innovation and the demand side of innovation. And finally, as a geographer, I'm obviously interested to know more about sort of how foundational economy comes in different shapes and sizes, dependent or contingent on regional context. And I think that there's more that could be done in terms of looking at the sort of the spatial variation in which the foundational economy sort of comes, and what that has to say for innovation processes in the foundational economy. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. And thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to return to my slides.
Lars, many thanks to you, to Chase, and to Julie for kicking us off in such an engaging way. I think the first question, we've had a number of questions coming through, and I think Ian actually wants to ask the first question to you, Lars. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all three speakers for really interesting talks. Got so many questions, really. One thing that really struck me was something Lars said that I thought was very interesting about scaling, and that maybe there was too much emphasis on trying to think about how to scale things up, and maybe some things didn't need scaling necessarily. And it put me in mind of kind of Strawberry Fields principle in the cooperative movement, and whether we ought to be thinking about, rather than scaling everything up to bigger and bigger levels, thinking more in a more network mode of thinking about. So I just wondered if Lars could reflect on that for us.
Yep, thank you very much. Yes, I think I have similarly sort of these reflections about scaling to bigger, and I think that is very much sort of the legacy of sort of looking at innovation and entrepreneurship through a sort of Schumpeterian lens of sort of, you know, growing the market. And I think, yeah, sort of empirical research on grassroots innovation has very much sort of questioned that, you know, market-based scaling is necessarily the only way that innovations can scale. And well, in some instances, you would see that the initiatives need to make compromises, and maybe some of the sort of value propositions get relaxed in terms of, you know, really relating to a local community. But I think what also is interesting is how sort of to call attention for, say, the global dimension or the global connections of social movements. And because I think, you know, we easily can get a little bit again stuck in just sort of celebrating sort of, you know, local victories and local value creation and capture. But if you sort of look at social innovation or grassroots innovation as a social movement, you can see that similar initiatives are popping up like a bit like a mushroom across the world in sort of pretty sort of interestingly similar ways. And I think something we haven't really researched yet is how also those sort of global, local social initiatives are connected and are learning from each other.
Okay, thank you, Lars. We've had a number of questions coming through. We may not have time. We may not have time to address them all, I'm afraid. But let me begin by posing a question to all the panelists. A question that has come in from Elizabeth Woodcock, where she says, how does the foundational economy 2.0 relate to the concept of the well-being economy? That's a question to all three of our panelists. Jace, would you like to begin?
Sure, I can at least try. So I have to admit that I haven't read the book about the well-being economy. So answering the very concrete question is a bit difficult. But what I do want to say is that the number of different sort of models out there or frameworks out there at the moment, which I think share a lot of similar principles, right? And one of those that we've been working on in Lund is that of donut economics, so Kate Rayworth. Where Madeleine, a colleague of mine, has been working on comparing the foundational economy with that of donut economics. And what comes out is that there are many similar points, but also some key differences between that, on the one hand, foundational economy, and the other one, donut economics. So one was, until recently, sort of the attention to environmental aspects. The second one is really about specificity of policy recommendations, where I think foundational economy has been very specific in building a framework around this idea of social licenses, where donut economics is much broader, but also not very sort of coherent in my reading. So there are many different ideas which sort of pop up, but it doesn't really constitute any sort of coherent policy response. And then finally, there's the point about the scale that Lars mentioned, right, in his presentation. Talked about how foundational economy is really based around the local or the regional. That plays a very important role, whereas donut economics is really coming from a global perspective, even though it's now being downscaled to the city scale in some places like Amsterdam and Copenhagen. But I think there's sort of a general point here, which is that it's probably a good idea to look at these different models that are out there at the moment and to try to understand how they complement each other. So we can get some kind of more elaborated alternative to the sort of dominant development model, which I think is still very much based around, well, making the market work and competitiveness, etc., like was also pointed out before.
Thanks, Tace.
Yeah.
Julie?
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, I think I agree with Tyson. I think there's all of these different concepts are really valuable, and the key thing is to kind of try to find a sort of synthetic view that brings them together. I think on the well-being economy specifically, I think there are several connections. I think the FE 2.0 idea, I think, definitely is picking up the notion of well-being, but also recognizing that there are these conflicts between the well-being of current and future generations, and the things that were contributed to the well-being of past generations are now contributing to the problems that we have to fix now. So I think it recognizes some of the tensions around sustainability that Toast mentioned in his presentation. I think the other thing that's worth saying is that one of the things around the foundational economy we've been trying to think about is the what matters, and trying to move beyond notions of GDP and GVA and monetary measures. And I think if you take the sort of the well-being approach, then you can think about ideas around livability. So it's not simply about what's your GVA per capita, but to what extent do you have access to a range of services that are necessary for a good quality life, whether that's housing, transportation, Wi-Fi, healthy food, all kinds of things that we might think were important. And I think hopefully one thing the foundational economy perspective contributes is this highlighting the non-income aspects of well-being. That income is important for some things, but many of the things that contribute to well-being can't be provided, by one person. Your clean air, your access to green or blue space, these things are collective outcomes, not things that individuals can buy for themselves. So I think there's lots of connections here.
Lars, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'll pick up on Julie's point about livability, because I used to live in what was apparently the most livable city in the world, Melbourne, and it sort of that triggered me about sort of the value proposition of innovation in sort of a development sort of context. And again, in the mainstream, we very much focus on the market value of innovations. And I think that is something both the foundational economy and the well-being economy sort of question whether that is the right way to value innovation. And I think there is some really interesting work coming also from Mariano Mazzucato about sort of questioning the value of innovation. But taking it to a place, to Melbourne, so there innovation was often not so much an issue in terms of economic growth, because the country and the city had been experiencing growth for more than 20 years, at least sort of pre-COVID-19. So there was not that sort of emphasis on we need innovation because we need economic growth, but there the emphasis was indeed on livability. What does innovation do to improve the livability of our city? And again, sort of then you can either sort of take a bit of a top-down perspective and start, thinking about new indicators, how to measure and compare cities in terms of livability, as, for example, The Economist has done. But I think what the foundational economy much more would emphasize is a constructivist sort of perspective on livability, and sort of to acknowledge that also livability and well-being are very place-based concepts, and sort of what you put into the well-being of a place, of a region, is basically something that comes about through social processes of deliberation and coordination around constructing a value around well-being. So again, I think it would be really interesting there to sort of put the value propositions of the foundational economy or of the well-being economy into an institutional context, and sort of see how different institutional, regional sort of contexts influence sort of what is valued in foundational economies across space. Thank you.
If I could just make a brief add-on to what Lois said here,
Please,
which
please.
also connects to one of the questions in the chat about how to measure this, right? How do we actually measure the foundational economy in ways that are not GVA, etc. Then of course it's about livability, but it's also about, of course, quality of the foundational services, but not just, I think, at the aggregate level, right? I mean, so in Danish we have this phrase saying that a society should be judged by how it takes care of its weakest members, and I think this really sort of hits the spot, or hits the nail here when we talk about foundational services, right? Because they should really be available to everybody. So, I think many of these livability rankings, they are based on sort of averages or maybe even elite perceptions, right? But what we talk about here is fundamentally different.
Yeah, if I could come in on that, we can talk about this all afternoon. But I think if you then start talking about livability, as you said, there's a kind of place-based dimension, but there's also a household dimension, that even in one region or one municipality, you find that the household experience is very different, particularly in relation to things like cost of housing. So you can have, you know, rich households in poor places and poor households in rich places, and we have to understand that sort of that mosaic. You know, where again in many, you know, European economies and even places like Melbourne, I guess the cost of housing is now such a big issue about well-being that we, you know, that again is an important direction for policy, to say that you can't solve livability unless you make sure there's access to good quality affordable housing for everyone.
Tezcan has asked me to address a question to all panelists. And he says, all the panelists have mentioned that there are strategies, innovative ideas and experiments going on and grassroots movements related to the FE. He says that there is a similar problem with the community food growing movement. For example, there was a community food growing action plan for Wales accepted 10 years ago, but somehow the movement could not grow despite the activity at the grassroots level. He says, what is actually lacking here? If there is a willingness, both at the macro level and the micro level, why is it so difficult to make the transition? Lars, as a transition expert?
Very good question. I don't have the insights to deal with the empirical sort of specificities, but I would immediately start looking into whether you could find any evidence of path dependencies in terms of institutions that are not aligned, that sort of preserve the status quo, not necessarily as sort of active resistance, but rather through sort of the power of habit, and you know, how, for example, practices in households with regard to food have just become very taken for granted, in terms of, you know, going to the supermarket and buying the cheapest sort of tin can off the shelf, and whether, you know, in that sort of habitual behavior and those sort of habitual institutions, whether you could find any sort of explanation for, you know, why these good intentions are not being realized, you know, despite a lot of activity and you know, hard work by an enthusiastic and dedicated group.
Tace, anything to add?
I can add maybe one thing, and I think that is that in many empirical fields, I mean, we've seen that policies tend to focus on like supporting the development of these sort of small niches around, for example, like community-based food co-ops, or etc., etc. But policy is much less hesitant, or much more hesitant, when it comes to actually trying to limit the ability of the large established players in a given socio-technical system to actually sort of limit their space for maneuver, right? So I guess in this empirical field, it would be about the big supermarket chains, right, that are offering all these very cheap products, right? So I mean, it might be that policies are then making it possible for these small niches to grow, and they can sort of get their small share of the market that maybe covers a very like tiny part of the population, but sort of the broader population, in order for them to sort of embrace this new niche, there will also need to be some kind of pressure on the types of actors that are today delivering food to them. And otherwise, it will probably stay small and nice forever without being able to sort of spread more throughout society.
Thank you. Julie?
Yes, exactly. I agree very much with that. I think if you look at the kind of I mean, I don't know anything about this particular scheme, so I can't talk about this specifically, but if you think about areas like food, you've got to look at the kind of the whole chain and where the power is. And clearly, food retailers have enormous amounts of power and they're very difficult to disrupt, and governments are very reluctant to disrupt them, despite the, you know, lots of studies suggesting it. But I mean, I can give you one analogous thing in relation to the woodland example, because again, you could say, well, you know, there's all kinds, you know, everybody apparently could agree that it would be a good thing to have more woodland and have more higher value use of woodland to decarbonize housing, etc., etc. But then if you look at the actors along the supply chain, the processors in timber producing very low value outputs are very happy because it's profitable. Why, you know, you've got to, in order to shift from a kind of low to a high value products, from kind of packaging to high value timber for construction, you've got to persuade the actors at different points that they need to change. And if you're comfortable in your position doing what you're doing, whether it's mass retailing, whether it's low value timber products, it's, you know, you're not going to change voluntarily until you're either, you know, persuaded, coerced, co-opted in some way to kind of be part of that coordinated action. So I think, again, it comes back to sort of the themes we've been talking about quite a lot this afternoon. It's kind of not standalone actors, it's coordination, it's integration, and all of these things are needed.
Thanks, Julie. Just a time for a couple of more questions. Emma Lewis asks a question concerning how much support is there in Welsh Government for FE development in Wales. We wouldn't expect Tace and Lars to address a question like that, but Julie, would you have a perspective, because you've been very, very engaged with the foundational movement in Wales?
Well, I think you could answer that question, Kevin, perhaps as well. I think it's tricky in some ways. I think, yes, there is support, and most obviously we've had the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, more than 50 projects, including some very interesting projects around community-based activities, local government-based activities, trying to encourage foundational economy activities, particularly in food, care, procurement, these kinds of sectors. So on the one hand, there has been quite a lot of formal acknowledgement and money going in. I think when we look at it, I think there's quite a long way to go in terms of seeing this as a kind of, you know, a principle across government. It's there in pockets. It's remembered one day and perhaps forgotten the next day. So I think it kind of illustrates, I think, some of the broader political problems about how do you kind of align agendas, how do you get some kind of consistency around things which are long-term problems and things, and the kind of political imperatives of the short term and needing to see quick results. So I think there is support, but I think most of us would think that, you know, the Welsh Government has a very good start and probably needs to go a little bit further.
I think that's exactly right. And the question reminds me of the debate in the international development community, where we have a lot to learn, I think, from that community, and particularly the work called Coalitions for Change, where they emphasize that the scope for transition is very, very uneven within governments. We shouldn't treat governments as unitary actors. And thinking about the Welsh Government, as we know, the work, Julie, that we've been doing with Carol and others in the Foundational Economy Network has shown us, hasn't it, that there are some politicians who are very committed. There's a few civil servants who are committed, and we have to identify these chinks of light and these progressive pockets, as you might refer to them, to move forward. And that's been one of the things that we've done. And I should say that on that point, on Thursday, we have one of those politicians, Lee Waters, with us to talk exactly about the scope for change within government. But since we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, I feel obliged to try to raise a couple of more questions that have come to us. Carla De Laurentiis says, the foundational economy implies that local and regional governments have a pivotal role to play, but there are big issues around the governance of key foundational sectors like energy and other utility services. how do we address those large governance challenges at a local or regional level? Thijs or Lars?
Well, I can go first and say that's a very tricky question, and then probably there's not a single answer to it, right? I mean, we're seeing different developments from municipalities taking back control of utilities that have previously been privatized, right? I mean, the idea of establishing social licenses, I think, is also a very important point. And I don't know to what extent this has actually been sort of carried out in reality, or whether sort of municipalities or regions are working with that idea. But I think it would be very interesting to also see how that works. So I think it's clear that leaving everything just to the market is not going to do the trick. But there might be a number of different ways of trying to get that control fully back or partly back when we talk about local and regional governments.
Lars?
Yeah, just very quickly, I just echo Thijs' answer that do we see some interesting developments happening in sort of the governance of say utility systems with sort of localizing power through kind of municipality buybacks, but on a more sort of broader sort of level, what Carla's question I think points to is also a sort of a word of warning that we should not sort of look at the foundational economy as if it's only being governed locally or regionally, but very much to sort of put it in the sort of multi-level governance perspective, in order not to sort of to become to basically ignore the bigger picture.
Julia, a final comment from you?
Yes, not too much to add, but I think just to reinforce the fact that I think the local and the regional can be a good approach, but doing this without the enabling frameworks from central state can go wrong. We've had examples in the UK, and I'm sure in other places, where municipalities have tried sort of entrepreneurialism around energy utilities, and they've ended up it's ended up being a real problem, and that then undermines the argument for kind of decentralization and municipalization. So I think that it requires that coordinated approach.
Okay, folks, we've run out of time now, because we're due to end at 4 o'clock, and I've got to make just a couple of final announcements. The first and foremost, of course, is to thank our three speakers for three really engaging presentations. So a warm thank you from all the participants to the three of you. I'd also like to thank Chloe McDonnell, who has been our online supremo behind the scenes, and has done an enormous amount of work to bring this webinar together. So on behalf of everyone, Chloe, a big warm thank you from all of us. And I'd also like to thank, of course, all the participants that have joined us today, and sorry for the questions that I run out of time to ask. I hope you'll engage with us tomorrow and Thursday and put those questions. And the final point I'd like to make is this. Tomorrow, the session is devoted to social justice. Today's was environment and sustainability, and tomorrow is on social justice, where again we have two excellent speakers. We have Rachel Reeves, a member of the Labour Party's shadow cabinet, and we have Fabrizio Barca of the famous Barca report on the future of cohesion policy in the European Union. Again, two excellent speakers, and I hope you'll all join us. So many thanks to everyone involved today, and I hope some of you will be able to join us tomorrow. So many thanks. Bye-bye.